Zach, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Why don't we start with your background, where you came from, how you got to be where you are today, and what you're working on.
Sounds good. So my current role is head of policy at the Lincoln Network, which is a small nonprofit that works to help bridge the divide between Silicon Valley and DC and bring a technical and innovation perspective to policy conversations. My work in particular is really focused on institutions that are important to the governance of innovation. So Congress is a major one there for us. And prior to joining Lincoln, I worked at a think tank called the R Street Institute, leading their tech and innovation policy program, also doing some work adjacent to this space on congressional issues. And before that, I worked at the Cato Institute, which is another right-leaning think tank. And so most of my career for over a decade in DC has been in the think tank world with some kind of academic adjacent side projects as well. So I'm also a fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Law School, and have done a few other things here and there with some other academic centers.
And where did you start off? Where are you from, and what did you study?
Yeah, I'm a Californian originally, transplanted to DC. There are many of us here. And my academic background is in political theory. So that was a lot more central when I was in a place like the Cato Institute, where sort of the libertarian ideology is central to a lot of their thinking about these issues. And I've evolved to be a little more technocratic in my policy thinking in my time, working in this space.
Great. So in broad strokes, what are you mainly interested in as part of your work? And then later on, we can focus more on the Congress stuff. But broadly speaking, where are your interests?
Yeah, so my work has been, really revolved around sort of the tech and innovation side of these issues. It's not even exclusively focused on Congress as an institution, as I suspect many of the people you're interviewing will be. But my interest in Congress developed out of one, working on some legislative data issues and transparency issues, and then also just the process of interacting with Congress and congressional staff, and getting the strong sense that we need to do some capacity building in this institution to get them to have a firmer grasp, particularly of these really challenging science and technology issues that they're grappling with today.
And so specifically in the Congress area, you're obviously looking at this concept of expertise, technology. Can you break down kind of the areas of your focus as it relates to Congress?
Yeah, so there's two buckets we try to focus on at Lincoln. And the first of those is sort of tech infrastructure, legislative data, transparency, but really, the core of this being the sort of idea of IT modernization and infrastructure. And then the second, as I mentioned, is the sort of tech, science and technology expertise and capacity, and that plays across a bunch of different places where it lives in the legislative branch, so that can have experts in personal offices, in committees, or in support agencies like the Government Accountability Office or the Congressional Research Service. Also fellowships like Tech Congress or AAAS bring outside experts in for a short time in Congress, or even detailees from the executive branch or another source of expertise. So there's a bunch of different places that there's this sort of in-house expertise function, and then there's also an even broader world outside that where nonprofits and think tanks engage, or congressionally chartered entities like the National Academy of Public Administration or Academy of Sciences will come and play a role in providing that expertise function.
So why don't we start with the infrastructure question? So tell me, what kind of questions or problems are you seeing in terms of tech infrastructure on the Hill, and what are the kinds of solutions that you see to those problems?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different places where technology plays a really important role, and it's hard to sort of give a quick soundbite summary of that. But it's important for all of the primary functions of Congress. For communicating with your constituents and sort of aggregating data about how your office and your employees are communicating with constituents, what their kind of feedback is on channels like these days, Instagram and even Clubhouse and new emerging social platforms are a place where I see members spending time and being, finding new effective ways to communicate. And so managing these sort of forms of new media, managing older forms of media like email or other correspondence is essential to have good tech infrastructure. It's also important for oversight and for legislation, seeing how a bill is changing in a markup, seeing versions of a bill as it moves through the institution and being able to access that quickly is super important. Or particularly during our current pandemic, being able to transition and manage those things digitally, whether that's having a hearing over a video conferencing service as we're doing this interview, for instance, or having bills submitted electronically. All of these things require really good infrastructure, and so this is a challenge that we're seeing. It's not unique to the legislative branch. It's something that we have a challenge across the federal government to modernize these 20th century or earlier analog institutions. And I think it's a place that we're in recent years seeing increased interest in Congress in addressing and investing in, which I think is a cause for optimism.
So what are the particular problems that exist there? Is it the system that they're using to track bills and markups? Is it comparing existing legislation to prior legislation or prior versions? Is it structuring the feedback around each bill? What kinds of problems are that are screaming out for, at least in your eyes, that are screaming out for solution?
Yeah, so it's been said that it's like dealing with 541 small businesses, which I think is not quite 100% accurate, but gets at this idea that there are a bunch of fiefdoms that each have their own priorities, and this governance of something like IT is dispersed all over the place. And so it's hard to manage. It's hard to get the efficiencies you get in say a private corporation where you can bulk purchase things and make central decisions and have a consistent kind of infrastructure strategy, right? That's hard when GAO makes decisions for it, the library makes its decisions, or often multiple entities within the library make different decisions about what their needs are, and then each individual office it varies between chamber. So this can make it tricky to have coordination on some of these IT issues. It's also a challenge that it's a kind of an opaque and difficult place to work if you're a vendor, and so it's also not quite big enough of a market for to attract some of the bigger players in the federal contracting universe. It has its own kind of particular needs and rules. For instance, there was a thing for a while where people didn't want to put data in the cloud because of speech or debate concerns. You don't want to get data dragged into a local divorce court filing or some other kind of lawsuit, or worse, have the law enforcement or the intelligence community snooping on you, although they sort of do that in other ways anyway. And so there was this really impulse towards sort of controlling that, which using the latest innovative solutions for some of these challenges. So it's been a slow path for them, but I think we've seen, as I said, a lot of interest here with the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, with legislative branch appropriations and its current leadership, particularly in the House Committee on House Administration, have all been providing really valuable leadership in moving things forward. And the House has always been, a little bit ahead of the Senate, a little bit more risk tolerant, and a little bit more eager historically to kind of adopt, some of these kind of tech solutions. And that goes, all the way back to, even sort of like in the 90s after the Republican Revolution, you started to see a lot of these innovations come actually from Gingrich's leadership when he became speaker, even though he did lots of other things that I think were significantly negative for the institution. Moving the ball forward on IT modernization was actually one of the good things he did.
So what about in terms of the way Congress is structured? Obviously, you have the personal offices, and there's a technology question there about their internal coordination. Then you have the committees, and then you have sort of these, I guess, institution-wide processes that need infrastructure. So,
yeah,
for personal offices, I can imagine it's sort of like a small business, like you said. What about the committees? Do they have any particular technology needs or infrastructure that they have that's independent of the institution and that needs to be upgraded, or data integrations? What's the situation when it comes to committees and technology?
Yeah, they have unique needs, just like they have different needs across support agencies and personal offices. They often have more resources at their disposal, so they can bring people on to help support some of that work. I think there are still some challenges with the compensation level, particularly for some higher end types of talent. Cybersecurity, for instance. So I think it's still something that the institution has a long ways to go on, and still needs more investment and thinking and people to come together to address some of these challenges.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about technology infrastructure for Congress as a whole, so there must be some kinds of systems that, for instance, repository for bills, and as they progress through the process, the data is integrated, and that's kind of like a congressional ERP system, if you will. So what's going on with those types of processes? Are they improving? Do they have challenges? What are the common complaints about those systems?
Yeah, so you may remember that Congress.gov is a fairly recent creation, and they had the sort of Thomas system before that. I think we've been seeing a good number of improvements incrementally on that system. There's still room for improvement, but it's gone a long way. On the House side, you can also go to places like docs.house.gov, or you can get XML, and you can get a lot of this sort of like key data in structured machine readable format now, which I think is great. And there's all kinds of great uses that civil society organizations have been able to put some of this stuff to. So there's also, each year there's a big conference around legislative data that they do internally, and outside stakeholders can come in. So that's a really great opportunity. There is a group called the Congressional Data Coalition that I'm involved in, with another group that works in the space called Demand Progress, and a few others that really focuses in on the details of some of these legislative branch data questions. And as I mentioned, you also see a lot of these sorts of issues come up in the recommendations of the Select Committee on Modern side. We'd like to see the Senate kind of take on a version of this as well. I think that would be a really productive direction for them to go. A lot of these decisions on the House side are in the CAO's office as well as the clerk's office, whereas in the Senate side, a lot of this resides with the sergeant at arms, and we just saw a leadership turnover there. So it may be an interesting opportunity in the next year or so to see what progress we're able to make in the Senate, on some of these issues as well.
So in terms of the challenges you mentioned, not up to date technology, lack of coordination, I would assume. So what are your suggestions on how to solve those problems? Is it really just a money problem? Is it a centralization or a leadership problem?
Yeah.
Where do you see the solution, and what is the solution?
Yeah, I mean, there's low hanging fruit, and then there's things that are harder to tackle, right? And things like the governance, how centralized it is, those are thornier things to address. One proposal that was floating a couple of years ago was to create a congressional digital service that would serve a role sort of like 18F or USDS in the executive branch. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I think you get some problems with, say, putting it in the CAO's office, which also does lots of other different things. And so the visibility of digital and IT issues is maybe not as high as it might otherwise be. And so I think that's a really interesting approach. Now, how do you get the institutional design right? How do you build that without, crossing into too many other people's turf, or in a way that takes on so many risks that it becomes a politically vulnerable place itself? I think if you get buy-in in a bipartisan way from leadership, that something like that can work. But short of that, there's lots of low-hanging fruit you can do to address some of the basics here. Some of that is, staffing and, kind of talent recruitment issues and retention issues, which is, broader than just sort of the IT side, but more people working on it, more resources for them to do some of this work, I think is important. We saw the creation of a modernization fund in the FY21 legislative appropriations bill, which I think will be really interesting to see what uses they put that to. Even though it's relatively small, I think there's a lot of small stuff you can do, and I think particularly in the wake of the pandemic and the needs, the technology needs that created, I think created a lot of interest in tackling some of these challenges. And so while there's not easy answers to everything, I'm really optimistic that it's become somewhat more salient than it used to be, right? Because before you have this challenge where people spending real serious time and resources and their own capital, building up the institution and building these systems that benefit everyone and benefit the functioning of our democracy, but maybe don't benefit an individual member. You're not getting campaign checks because you're making the IT infrastructure more secure or more functional. And you might be stepping on people's toes who like doing things the way they've always done them instead of some new way. So I don't think you get a lot of political rewards for doing that hard work. So we need to kind of create some of those, I think, positive feedback loops as well for some of the people who are now taking on that kind of work.
And the power for that kind of changes in the House, I assume, is the administration committee.
Well, there's a few different vehicles for reform here. One of the main ones is the legislative branch appropriations bill, which happens reliably each year. There are, of course, other ways to do things. You often have limits about what authorizing language you can do. That's a sticking point for Republicans more than it is for Democrats. And in our current environment, we may see a little bit more flexibility in that regard. You can also, within the legislative branch, put things in not just the legislative text, but the report, the language of the report that's attached to the bill, which is less forceful, but in the legislative context, carries quite a lot of weight. So that's often also a way to get things done. And then otherwise, there's still a lot of leeway within individual offices and committees to improve their own operations, as well as within support agencies to take on addressing their infrastructure challenges. We just saw today they had a budget hearing in the House for GAO and a few other entities that operate in the space. And one of the things in the GAO budget request was, talking about how they're addressing their own IT infrastructure challenges and how they've been, moving to do some innovative things. I think they did a project with 18F in one of their science and tech offices to do some interesting data analytics work around COVID-19 oversight, which is really interesting. Interestingly enough, 18F can do service contracts for legislative branch entities, which is interesting. Yeah, so those are some of the vehicles. You can also, so the select committee has no formal lawmaking powers, so it makes recommendations. Nearly all of them, I think, have been unanimous in the past Congress. I think they're trying to take that approach again, although they have not yet nominated the vice chair, the Republican co-chair for the committee. So we'll have to see who that is to see what direction they take and what priorities they take on, and whether they'll try to do bigger stuff than the last cycle, which will be interesting. But those recommendations, because these issues are so low salience, those recommendations can be very helpful in one, signaling that there's bipartisan consensus, because there's a pretty broad ideological range for the members on that committee, and elevate those things to get broader support and buy-in and move them across the finish line. So they can then take those and run them through the appropriate authorizing committee. CHA has a lot of that in the House side, but it does vary a bit. We talked about GAO, and the authorizing committee for GAO on the House side is House Oversight. So these things have committee jurisdiction can be somewhat tricky and arcane, as you likely know, I'm sure. So
great. Well, let's move on to the other subject I think that you've spent a lot of time on, which is this concept of expertise in Congress. So can you talk a little bit about what you do in that area? What are the big challenges you see, and if you found any interesting opportunities for improvement there?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that got me interested in Congress, particularly in science and technology, is that the other part of my portfolio is doing science and technology policy, not just capacity building and interacting with congressional offices. I, to put it politely, saw a strong need for more expertise building, and so this led to a project that I started when I was at R Street, working with Kevin Kosar, who I believe you interviewed. And so we wrote a paper together on reviving the Office of Technology Assessment, which was a legislative branch agency that existed from 1974 to 1996, when it was fully shuttered. And this agency was sort of like CRS, but it served more kind of like the national academies, provided really multidisciplinary kinds of analysis. So CRS tends to do shorter form, kind of more literature review type work. That's not always the case. They do occasionally some original analytic work too, but generally they're shorter and more digestible. Whereas what OTA did was these big, long, authoritative studies that took in a lot of perspectives and a lot of different disciplines and gave these, what they call policy options for Congress. So unlike a think tank like, the Center for American Progress or the Heritage Foundation, which will typically have a white paper and it'll be one or two authors, and it'll have, this is the recommendation, Congress should pass this bill or do this reform. The format of OTA reports typically was, if you do this approach, these are the trade-offs. If you do that approach, these are the trade-offs, and it would list several different options. Neutral generally as to which one Congress should adopt, the theory being that you're informing Congress about the sort of values trade-offs that they're elected to make, and that, given the sort of highly technical nature of some of these questions, that they need to be better informed about what will happen, but they don't necessarily need to be told how to act. And I think that's a really interesting model that's, even different than the National Academy of Sciences, which tends to be more consensus oriented in the kinds of recommendations that it produces. And so you don't see a lot like that these days. So this was the OTA. It had a statutory limit of 143 staff at the end of its time, plus around 50 or so kind of contract-based staff that would bring in sort of on rotation. Having this sort of rotator model is a sort of a common thing in science agencies. So the National Science Foundation or DARPA will have some iterations of this as well. And they, had a lot of sort of PhD experts that focused in on, specific areas of expertise, in contrast with CRS or a policy staffer on a committee who will tend to specialize in a very broad portfolio of issues rather than just a couple. So that was the sort of OTA model. And there was a big conversation over the past couple of years about, should we bring this back in some form? This came, I think, particularly around them dragging before Congress a number of tech CEOs and having high profile hearings on kind of more cutting edge technology issues, whether that's cryptocurrencies or whether that's quantum computing. And so there were these sort of highly publicized hearings where members had a few gaffes about what they're talking about. And, you might remember there's some interchange with like Mark Zuckerberg, and there's a line like, "We run ads, Senator, is how we make our money." And I think this was sort of widely made fun of. Often these gotcha moments are kind of a little bit out of context, but nonetheless, I think there was awareness that there is this sort of technical capacity gap in Congress. And so how did we get there? We talked about Newt Gingrich a little bit earlier. And in this case, I think this is around the time we saw a lot of these big capacity cuts start to happen around the Republican Revolution and the rise of the Gingrich speakership in '95. And going from the early 90s to today, we can see there have been really substantial capacity losses in support agencies and committees, nearly 40% in both cases. Not to mention that the sort of quality of outputs are diminishing, and the number of hearings we're seeing is less. There's more resources moving from policy work to communications staff and to constituent services work. So the if we're looking at sort of House offices, the relative resource share of district offices has substantially increased, which suggests sort of away from policy work. You even saw this Congress, I think it was Madison Cawthorn, who said that his whole office hiring strategy is oriented to communications. It's not oriented to policy. And this is something people, I think, make fun of a little bit, but it's really a story of the sort of institutional dysfunction where members see it as a sort of fool's game to try to good faith have meaningful contributions to policy making because they're not afforded those opportunities. And so this gets into a range of other kind of dysfunctions in the institution. But I think a major part of this, not the whole story, but a major part of this story is a sort of loss of policy capacity across the institution. So that manifests in defunding the OTA, but it also manifests in the staff losses at GAO and on committees, and even at CRS, you've seen, this is something Kevin has written about a lot, a shift towards being more risk averse in the ways they talk about policy issues, and also a shift from having more senior specialist staff writing reports to more junior people, whereas the sort of senior roles are taken up by more managers. And so I think this has created this real challenge in the institution, particularly on science and technology issues, because members and staff don't tend to come from those kinds of backgrounds. Members tend to be from law or business or finance. There are very few scientists and engineers. And so, how they kind of grok these issues is not always native. And I think, the funny artifacts of jurisdiction can also be a problem here too, which we talked about. Like, there was a hearing in the Agriculture Committee last Congress about crypto, and why is that in the Agriculture Committee? Because they have jurisdiction of some commodities, and some commodities are considered, some of these sort of crypto commodities are in there, and so you have these guys comparing this, these guys who normally work on farm subsidies and what's going on with the peanut farm, trying to wrap their head around NFTs or Ethereum or what have you, right?